You've met a man like the one in this story. Maybe you've been him. The one who does the thing everyone tells him not to do, in the place everyone says is wrong, in a way nobody understands, and takes the laughter without flinching, because some quiet part of him knows something the loud people don't. I'm an old rancher. I've buried more animals than friends and more friends than I'd like, and I've kept a weather log every single day for 31 years because my father did and his father did, and because writing the sky down is the only prayer I ever learned to say right. I'm not a storyteller by trade, but there's a night I have never been able to put down, no matter how many times I close the book on it. So I'm going to tell it to you the way it happened, slow where it was slow and fast where it nearly killed us, and I'm going to ask just one thing of you. Don't decide who the fool is until the snow stops. Because the night the blizzard came down off that ridge, every single person who'd laughed at the man on the hill was praying he'd open his door. Stay with me. This is going to take all three parts to tell, and I promise you'll feel it in your chest before the end. The first thing I remember is the sound the wind made coming around the corner of my barn, not a howl. People always say howl, but it wasn't that. It was lower. A long, flat groan, the way a building sounds right before it gives up. I was standing in my kitchen with a coffee gone cold in my hand, and I was watching the thermometer on the porch post drop like somebody had cut the string on it. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sky had already gone the color of a bruise 3 days old. I want to tell you I knew. I want to be the man in the story who reads the clouds and saddles up and saves everybody. But the truth is I stood there fidgeting with the busted pocket watch I keep in my vest. It doesn't run, hasn't run since my wife passed. I just rub the cracked glass with my thumb when I'm thinking too hard, and I told myself it'd blow through by morning. That's what we tell ourselves out here. It'll blow through. We say it about weather and grief and bad years the exact same way, and we're wrong about all three in the exact same proportion. By 5 it was snowing sideways. By 6 you couldn't see the fence line. By 7 the phone was dead, the power flickered twice and quit, and I lit the lamp with hands that weren't as steady as I'd have liked, and I wrote in my log by that yellow light, heaviest I've seen, falling 2 in, an hour maybe more. God help anybody on the road. I didn't know yet that there were 11 of them. Let me back up. You can't understand the night without the year, and you can't understand the year without the man, so let me give you the man. His name was Elias Crane. He came into our valley the spring before, drove up in a truck that had clearly carried everything he owned more than once, an old gray thing with a tarp lashed over the bed and a dog riding shotgun with its head out the window like it owned the county. He bought the worst 40 acres in 3 townships. I mean that plainly. The Hallorn place, we used to call it, after the family that starved out of it back before my time. It sat up against the North Ridge, all of it sloped, half of it rock, exposed to the wind on a side of the mountain where the snow comes down like the mountains trying to shrug you off. Good land sits low and flat where the water gathers. Everybody knows that. You build in the bottoms near the creek, where the cottonwoods grow and the wind has to work to find you. That's not opinion. That's 200 years of people who lived and people who didn't. Elias Crane built on the hill. Worse, he built up the hill. Not even at the base of it where you'd at least have some shelter from the rise behind you. He cleared a flat shelf maybe 2/3 of the way up, a spot with nothing above it but bare rock and sky, and he started hauling timber. I rode up there once, that first summer, the way a neighbor does. Brought a jar of my wife's, brought a jar of preserves I'd had in the cellar a while. He met me at the edge of his clearing with sawdust in his beard and a hand plane in his fist, and a look on his face like he was deciding whether I was worth the interruption. The dog sniffed my boots and lost interest. "You're the rancher," he said, "not a question." "I'm a rancher," I said, "one of several you're building." "I am." I looked at what he had so far, and I'll be honest with you because I promised I would, it didn't look like a cabin. It looked like a man's stubbornness had taken physical form. The walls were going up too thick, way too thick double-coursed timber with something packed between, which is a fool's amount of work and a fool's amount of wood. The roof was pitched steeper than any roof I'd seen, near vertical like a church steeple flattened out, and the whole thing faced wrong. The big window, the front of the house, it didn't look out over the valley the way any sane person would build for the view. It faced the open slope, the bald, wind-scoured, God-forsaken north slope. Your windows pointed at the weather, I told him. I know where the weather comes from, he said. Most folks like to see the valley. Most folks, he said, and went back to his planning, build in the valley. I left the jar on a stump. I don't think he ever ate it, but he raised a hand when I rode off, which from Elia's crane I'd later learn was practically a love letter, and I rode back down to the bottoms thinking what everybody in the valley was already saying. That man's going to learn the hard way. You have to understand how a small place talks. We don't gossip cruel mostly. We gossip the way you'd worry a loose tooth, can't leave it alone, keep going back to it, half because it hurts and half because it's the only interesting thing in your mouth. And Elia's crane was the most interesting thing in our valley in years. At the feed store, men would lean on the counter and shake their heads. Heard he's putting in a root cellar DEEPR in a grave. Heard he hand-dug a well up on solid rock, took him till July. Heard he won't run a line down to the road. Says he don't want the power, says he don't want it or can't pay it. And then the laugh, not loud. Just that low dismissive chuckle men do when they've decided a thing is beneath them, the sound of a community closing ranks around its own common sense. At the church social the women were gentler but it cut the same. Poor man. No wife, no family anybody's seen. Lonely way to live all the way up there. Building himself a tomb is what? The children, of course, were the most honest. The children called it the witch house. They'd dare each other to ride bikes partway up the road and look at it through the trees, that strange, steep-roofed, thick-walled thing crouched on the bare shelf of the mountain, and they'd race back down shrieking with the delicious terror of it. And me, I'll tell you exactly what I did, because I'm not going to come out of this story clean, and I'd rather you didn't think I tried to. I laughed too. Not at the social, not to be cruel. But there was an evening in October, the leaves all gone gold and the air gone sharp, and a couple of the younger ranchers were at my place helping me move cattle to the lower pasture, and we were resting the horses and somebody pointed up at the hill where you could just see a thin line of smoke coming off Elia's crane's chimney, straight up in the still air. Look at him, one of the boys said, building a fortress against a war that ain't coming. And I said, I remember it exactly. I've turned it over 1,000 nights since, I said. Some men can't live easy. Got to make life hard so they've got something to push against. And the boys laughed, and I let them, and I felt clever. I want that sentence back more than I want almost anything. Now the year. It was a strange year for weather, and I should have read it better, being a man who writes the sky down every morning. The summer ran hot and dry, then broke late and wet. The aspens turned 3 weeks early. In November the geese went over going south in numbers I hadn't seen since I was a boy, great ragged skeins of them, days and days of geese, all of them in a hurry. My grandmother used to say the geese know the winter's teeth before the winter does. I wrote it in my log and underlined it and then did exactly nothing about it, because knowing a thing and acting on it are two different muscles, and most of us only ever exercise the first one. The valley went into December soft and unready. Folks hadn't laid in the wood they should have. The county only had the one working plow truck, the other one being apart in pieces in Dale Mercer's shop, waiting on a part that was waiting on a truck that was waiting on a thaw that wasn't coming. The school stayed open later than it should have because nobody wanted to be the one to call it. We all just sort of leaned into the season the way you lean into a door you assume will hold. And up on the hill, all that while, smoke kept rising off Elia's crane's chimney. Straight up most mornings. I'd see it from my kitchen window over my coffee. He'd cut and stacked wood all summer and fall. I'd see him at it whenever I rode the high fence line, splitting and stacking, splitting and stacking. A winter's worth and then another winter's worth on top of it. Ranks of split wood under the deep eaves of that strange steep roof, until the whole north wall of his cabin was armored in cordwood. Fortress against a war that ain't coming, the boy had said. The war was coming. It was 3 months out and gathering, and not one of us could read it, and the only man in the valley who'd built for it was the one we'd all decided was a fool. The storm announced itself the way the bad ones do, not at all. The morning of the day it came, I stepped out at first light to feed, and the air was warm. Unnatural warm, that heavy still warmth that has no business in December, and the sky was a flat featureless white from edge to edge with no sun in it anywhere, just a brightness with no source. I stood on my porch and the warmth touched my face, and every animal I owned was standing dead still in the corral, none of them eating, all of them facing north. I rode in my log dead calm, warm, stock spooked, barometer dropping fast, and under it because some old part of me did know, after all, I wrote, bringing everything in. I spent the whole morning doing it. Brought the cattle down from the lower pasture and crowded them into the barn and the loafing shed, more animals than those buildings were meant to hold, packed warm flank to flank. Brought the horses in, filled every trough and bucket I had, hauled wood until my back gave out, then hauled more. Dale Mercer's wife called on the phone that still worked then and asked, was I getting ready for something, and I said I didn't know, just a feeling, and she laughed that laugh, kind but certain, and said her Dale figured it'd be a dusting. By 2, the warmth was gone like a hand lifted off my face. By 3, the wind came around to the north, and the temperature started to fall, and I watched it fall. Stood on my porch and watched the mercury drop through the 30s, the 20s, kept dropping, and the first snow came not as flakes but as a kind of grit, a hard granular hiss against the window glass, ice driven flat by a wind that was already screaming. And by 4 I was standing in my kitchen with that cold coffee, fidgeting with my dead watch, watching the world erase itself. I didn't think about Elias Crane that night. I want to be honest about that too. I was too busy being afraid for my own animals, my own roof, my own self. The wind got into the barn somehow, and I went out 3 times in the dark with a rope tied around my waist and the other end on the porch post, because that's what my father taught me. You can lose the 10 feet between your house and your barn in a whiteout and never find it again. Men have died that close to their own doors, and each time I went out the cold was a thing with hands. It got inside my coat. It got inside my chest. It found the place where I keep my dead wife's name, and it squeezed. Somewhere around midnight, fighting the barn door shut for the 3rd time, I looked up. I don't know why. You don't look up in a blizzard. There's nothing up there but the thing that's killing you. But I looked up north toward the ridge. And through the screaming dark, through a wall of snow so thick I couldn't see my own hand at the end of my arm, I saw, far up on the black shoulder of the mountain, one small square of warm gold light. His window, the big window, the one we'd all laughed at, the one that faced the weather. It was the only light in the whole world. I stood there in the dark with the rope around my waist and the cold in my chest, and I watched that little gold square shining out of the storm like the last ember of something. And I had a thought I have never told another living soul until right now, telling you. I thought, he's up there warm. And then right behind it, sharp as a slap, he built for this. He built for exactly this. And we laughed at him every single day while he did it. I didn't know yet about the 11. I didn't know that at that very moment, on the county road that ran along the base of the ridge, a church van carrying 9 people home from a Christmas program in the next town had slid off into the ditch and buried itself to the windows. I didn't know that the driver, a young Sunday school teacher named Maria Haverson, had her 2 own children plus 7 others packed in behind her, the youngest 4 years old, and that the van's heater was already failing, and the snow was already covering them, and the radio was already dead. I didn't know that of every door in that valley, Every warm, safe house down in the sensible bottoms where smart people built. The closest one, the only one within reach of a person walking blind through that killing dark, was the door of the fool on the hill. I went back inside. I latched my door against the storm. I sat by my lamp and I rubbed the cracked glass of my watch with my thumb, and I listened to the wind try to take my house apart board by board. And 11 people I'd never thought about in my life were about to find out what that strange man had really been building. All those months we laughed. Everything I'm about to tell you, I had to gather later in pieces, the way you'd gather glass off a floor in the dark carefully, and never quite all of it. Some of it came from Maria Haverson, weeks after, in a kitchen that smelled of coffee while her hands shook around the cup. Some came from the children, who tell it the way children tell things, sideways and certain and full of details no adult would think mattered. A little came from Elias Crane himself, though getting words out of that man was like getting water out of a fence post, and what he gave me slow. And some of it I read in the snow the next morning, before the wind smoothed it over. The story was written out there in the drifts for one short while, and I was one of the few who got to read it before it was gone. So this is true as a thing can be that you weren't standing inside of. Let me put you in the van. Maria Haverson was 26 years old that night, and she had 9 children in her keeping, 2 of them her own. The Christmas program had run long, they always do. Somebody's lamb costume always tears. Somebody's mother always wants one more photo, and they'd left the church in the next town a full hour later than she'd promised the parents. The snow had been nothing when they set out. A pretty nothing, the kind that makes children press their faces to the glass. By the time they hit the county road along the base of our ridge, it had stopped being pretty. She told me she knew it was bad when she couldn't find the center line. Then when she couldn't find the edge. Then when the road and the ditch and the field beyond it had all become one white nothing, and she was driving by feel and by prayer, going slower and slower, the wipers losing the fight, the headlights bouncing back off the snow into her own eyes, so the light became a kind of blindness. She didn't feel the wheels leave the road. That's the part she kept coming back to. I didn't even feel it. One moment she was driving and the next the van was tilted nose down and still, and the engine had stalled, and the only sound was 9 children gone suddenly, terribly quiet, and the wind hitting the side of the van like a fist hitting a drum. She got the engine started again, ran the heater, told the children it was an adventure, told them in the bright steady lie of a voice that good teachers learn, told them help was coming. Help was not coming. She knew it even as she said it. The phone showed no bars. The radio gave her static and then nothing. And the snow was already climbing the windows. She watched it climb, watched the world outside the glass shrink, the bottom going white, then the middle, the dark gray of the storm pressing down to a narrowing band at the top of each window, and then to nothing at all. The van was being buried. Slowly, patiently, the way the cold buries everything it's allowed to. The heater died a little after 11. She told me she knew the time because the 4-year-old, a boy named Toby with a cowlick that wouldn't lie down, had asked her if it was past his bedtime, and she'd looked at the dashboard clock, and the green numbers were the last thing on it still glowing. When the heat went, the cold came in like it had been waiting at the door. Within 20 minutes the windows were furred with ice on the inside. The children stopped complaining, which is the worst thing children can do, and started getting sleepy, which is worse than worst, because Maria's grandfather had been a hunter and she knew. She knew the sleepy was the cold getting into them, slowing them down, and that some of the smaller ones might just go to sleep and not be talked back out of it. She had to make a decision, and there was no good one in it. Stay in the van where there was no more heat, where they were already freezing, and hope for a rescue she had no reason to believe in. Or take 9 children out into a blizzard that could kill a grown man in the open in an hour, with no idea where to go. And it was while she was sitting in that frozen, narrowing dark with no good choice in front of her, scraping at the windshield with her bare fingernails just to see out, just to feel like she was doing something. It was then that she saw it. Far up the black slope above the road, tiny, steady, gold. One light. Now let me take you up the hill, to the man who'd lit it. Elias Crane was awake. He told me he was always awake in a big storm. He said it like it was obvious, like only a fool would sleep through weather that was trying to get in. He had the wood stove going and the lamps lit and that big strange window, the one we'd all mocked, the one that faced the weather instead of the view, he had it uncovered, and he was sitting in front of it the way another man might sit in front of a television. Watching the storm, reading it. That window, you see, that was the first thing we'd been wrong about. He hadn't built it to look at anything pretty. He'd built it to watch the slope, the open north face where the weather came from, the long, bald run of mountain below his shelf. A man who builds in the bottoms can't see the weather until it's on top of him. A man who builds up high, facing the danger, can watch it come for miles. Elias Crane had built himself a watchtower, and we'd called it a fool's idea of a view. So he was watching when, far down the slope, he saw the van's lights go off the road. He saw them tilt and stop. He saw them shine straight up into the falling snow for a while, a smeared smudge of brightness in all that dark. And then he saw them dim and go out, swallowed up as the drifts climbed over them. He knew exactly what it was. He'd driven that road. He knew there was no house within 2 miles of where those lights had gone dark. He knew the cold and he knew the time, and he did the arithmetic that we all should have been able to do and that none of us, warm in our sensible houses in the bottoms, were even awake to attempt. And here is the decision. Here is the heavy thing. Elias Crane was 58 years old. He had a bad hip from a life he never told anyone about, and a heart he'd had a doctor frown at once. He had built that cabin specifically, to be a place a man could survive the worst the mountain could do by staying inside it. Every thick wall, every cord of wood, every gallon of water in that deep cellar well, all of it was built around one simple idea. When the killing weather comes, you go in, and you do not come out until it's done. That was the whole design. That was the genius of it, if it was genius. Survival by staying put. And the lights going dark down the slope were asking him to do the one thing his entire fortress was built to prevent. They were asking him to open his door and walk out into the exact thing he'd spent a year and his whole back and the last of his money learning to hide from. He told me this is one of the few full sentences I ever got from him about that night, and I'll give it to you the way he gave it to me, plain, he said. A house that only saves the man who built it isn't worth the wood. Then he put on every layer he owned. He tied a rope to the iron ring he'd set in the doorframe, and I want you to notice that, the iron ring, set into the doorframe, a thing none of us understood the purpose of when we'd seen it, a thing that made no sense for a man who lived alone and was never going anywhere. He'd set it there for a night exactly like this one, years before that night existed. He paid out the rope as far as it would go, lashed a lantern to a pole, and he and the dog went down the mountain into the storm. I need to stop here and tell you what it is to move in a true whiteout, because I don't think people who haven't done it can hold it in their minds, and if you can't hold it, you can't understand what Elias Crane and Maria Haverson did. You cannot see. That's the first thing, and it's total. Not dim, not foggy, gone. The lantern at the end of his pole lit up a swirling wall of white and nothing behind it. He couldn't see the ground. He found it with his feet, 1 foot at a time, testing, because the slope was full of rocks and holes the snow had smoothed over into one innocent-looking white that would break your ankle or your neck. You cannot hear. The wind takes everything. Maria was screaming up the slope and Elias was calling down it, and for the longest time neither could hear the other over a wind that he said sounded like a freight train that never finished passing. You cannot stay warm, not moving, not stopped, not ever. The cold gets into the meat of you. Your hands stop working first. He said his hands stopped being his hands somewhere on the way down, that he had to look at them to know if they were holding the rope. Then your thinking goes. That's the part that kills the strong ones, the ones who'd survive on toughness alone. The cold gets into your judgment before you know it's there, and you make one small, stupid decision, and the small, stupid decision is the last one you make. And the dog, Lord, the dog. That dog went down the slope ahead of him on a longer rope, casting back and forth, nose down, and it was the dog that found them. Not Elias, the dog. It found the buried van by the smell of 9 frightened children leaking up through the snow. And it stood on top of the drift over the van, and it barked and barked until Elias could follow the sound, until he stumbled into the side of a thing in the dark and put his ruined hands on it and realized it was metal. He dug down to the window with his arms. He told me that part with a kind of wonder, like he still couldn't believe his own body did it. He dug down through 3 feet of packed snow to the dark window of that van with arms that had stopped being able to feel, and he put his face to the glass. And on the other side of it, in the freezing dark, Maria Haverson put her face to the same glass from the inside. And for 1 second the two of them just looked at each other through that thin sheet of ice. She told me she thought she was already dead, and he was the thing that comes for you. He told me he thought for 1 terrible second that he was too late, that the white faces inside were the faces of children who'd already gone to sleep. Then Toby, the 4-year-old, the cowlick Toby, waved at the dog. And that small hand moving was the thing that told both of them on both sides of the glass that there was still time. Barely, but still. Getting out was its own war, and I'll be brief about it only because what came after matters more. There were 11 of them now, counting Elias and Maria, 9 children and 2 adults, and 1 rope, and 1 lantern, and 2 miles of killing dark between the van and any door, except for the 1 door that was only a 1/4 mile up the slope but straight up into the wind on a buried mountainside. They could not all hold the 1 rope and climb. The smallest ones couldn't climb at all. Maria's own daughter, 6 years old, had stopped being able to feel her feet. Toby could not have walked 10 yards. So here is the second heavy decision of that night, and it was Maria's. Elias could carry. His hip was bad, but his back, that overbuilt back that had stacked all that wood, could carry. He could take 2 of the smallest at a time, 1 on his front and 1 on his back, lashed on with the strips of blanket Maria tore. But that meant going up the mountain and coming back down 3 times. It meant Maria staying in the freezing dark with the children who waited, keeping them awake, keeping them moving, keeping them alive, with no rope, no lantern. He had to take the lantern. He had to be able to find the cabin, alone in the white nothing with the cold getting into all of them, not knowing if he'd make it up even once, let alone back down 3 times, while the children she'd promised to keep safe got sleepier and sleepier in her arms. She could have insisted they all go together, all clinging to 1 rope, and watched the small ones fall off it 1 by 1 in the dark. She chose to let him carry. She chose to stay behind in the dark 3 separate times, and send the strongest among them away up the mountain with the lantern and the warmth and the only sure path to safety, and to keep her faith, alone, that he would come back for her, that the fool on the hill would climb down into the storm 3 times for children who weren't his. I have thought about that choice more than almost any in my life. To stay in the killing dark and trust. To hand your children, 2 at a time, to a near stranger you've known for the length of a rescue, and let him disappear with them up into a white roar, and stand there in the cold counting the minutes, not knowing if the next thing to come out of the storm would be him coming back or nothing coming back at all, ever. She did it 3 times. And the cabin, oh the cabin. Every foolish thing about it became, that night, the thing that saved their lives. Let me lay them out for you the way I laid them out for myself the next morning, standing in the wreck of the storm with my hat in my hands. The thick walls, the absurd, double-coursed, wood-packed walls we'd all sneered at as a waste of timber, held the heat of that wood stove like a thermos holds coffee. When Elias carried the first 2 children through the door, the room was warm. Not bearable. Warm. A small room with massive walls and a hot stove will hold its heat against a blizzard the way a thin house never can, and hours down in the bottoms never could. The steep, near-vertical roof, the church steeple roof the children laughed at, shed the snow as fast as it fell. A flat roof or a gentle one would have loaded up with 2, 3, 4 feet of snow that night and could have caved in on top of them. His shed it like water off a duck. By morning his roof was nearly bare while my barn roof groaned under a load that I spent the next day terrified would come down on my cattle. The cordwood armoring the north wall, the obscene, excessive, 2 winters' worth of wood, meant he never once had to go outside for fuel. He fed that stove all night and into the next day and the day after and never opened the door to the storm again after the last trip down. A man with a sensible woodpile, out by the shed the way sensible people keep it, would have had to choose between freezing and walking out into a whiteout for his own fuel. The deep cellar well, the well he'd hand-dug into solid rock all the way through July, while we laughed about it at the feed store, gave him water when every pipe in the valley froze solid, including mine, including the town's. He had water and we did not. The iron ring in the doorframe, the watchtower window, the high shelf of land that let him see the weather coming for miles when the rest of us couldn't see past our own porches. Not one thing about that cabin was a fool's idea. Every single thing we'd laughed at was a man who had survived something once, somewhere, in a life he never spoke of, building so he would never be at the mercy of it again, and building it large enough, by some grace I still don't understand, to put 11 souls inside it on the worst night any of us had ever seen. He hadn't built a tomb. We'd had it exactly backwards. Down in the sensible bottoms in our thin, warm houses by the frozen creek, we were the ones the weather could have buried. He'd built an ark, and we'd laughed at him every day while he did it. But I've gotten ahead of the night, in my hurry to make the point, and the night wasn't done with them yet. Because on the 3rd trip down, the last one, the one carrying Maria herself and the very last child, Toby, something went wrong. The wind, which had been a steady killing roar all night, gusted. Elias said it came up the slope all at once like a wall, like the mountain had inhaled and breathed out, and it took the lantern. Just took it. Ripped it off the pole and out into the dark, and the light was gone, simply gone, and the 3 of them were standing on the open face of the mountain in total blackness, with a 1/4 mile of buried slope between them and the door. And the rope. He'd run out the rope to its full length on the first trip and been following it ever since. Hand over frozen hand, the rope in the dark. In his hands he could no longer feel the rope. Maria told me his voice changed then. All night he'd been steady, low, cert, the voice of a man doing a thing he'd somehow prepared his whole life to do. And in the dark, with the lantern gone, she heard him say, very quietly, almost to himself, the only frightened thing he said all night. He said, "I can't feel the rope. I can't feel the rope." Maria heard him say it, and she told me that in that moment something in her went very still and very clear, the way water goes still right before it freezes solid. She had a 6-year-old's worth of weight already failing in her own numb arms, her daughter, gone quiet against her chest, and 4-year-old Toby lashed to Elias' back with strips of blanket, his small face turned in against the man's shoulder. The lantern was gone out into the dark. The wind was a wall. And the one thread holding all of them to the world, the rope that ran from Elias' frozen, hands up the buried slope to the iron ring in his own doorframe, that thread had become invisible to the only sense that could have found it. You and I, sitting warm, want there to be a clever trick here, a flash of genius. The fool who wasn't a fool pulling one last marvel out of his sleeve. There wasn't one. There almost never is in the real ones. What there was instead was an old man on his knees in the snow. He went down. Maria felt him go down rather than saw it, the rope line between them suddenly slack and low, and she thought, he's fallen. That's it. That's the end of us. And she got ready in some animal part of herself to die on that mountain with 2 children in her arms. But he hadn't fallen. He'd knelt. on purpose. Because if his hands couldn't feel the rope, then he would find it another way, and so Elias Crane, 58 years old with a bad hip and a frowned at heart and arms that had stopped being arms an hour ago, got down on his knees in the killing dark and put his face to the snow and felt for the rope with his cheek. He found it, a cold line laid along the snow, and he pressed the side of his face to it the way you'd press your ear to a wall to hear what's on the other side, and he kept his face there, and he started to crawl up the slope, on his knees with a 4-year-old lashed to his back, dragging his dead hands along beside him just to keep them on the line, following the rope by the 1 inch of skin on his face that could still feel the difference between rope and snow. Maria crawled behind him. She put her free hand on his boot and she crawled and she sang. She told me that part almost ashamed, like it was a foolish thing to admit. She said she sang Christmas carols, the ones from the program they'd left, because Toby liked them and because if the children could hear singing, they wouldn't know how scared the grown-ups were. And because, she said, she had to put her breath into something or she'd have started to scream and never stopped. So that's how they came up the last quarter mile of that mountain. An old man crawling on his face along a rope he couldn't feel, a young woman behind him with her hand on his boot, singing into a wind that tore the song to pieces, and a 4-year-old on the man's back who later told everyone, with total confidence, that they'd ridden a dragon up the hill. And then the dog. The dog had stayed at the cabin with the children already carried up. Maria had told it to, and it had, against every instinct in it, lain across the doorway and guarded 7 half-frozen children in a warm room while the man it loved disappeared back into the dark a 3rd time. But on that last trip, the dog couldn't bear it anymore. It came out. It came down the rope line the way it had come down to the van, casting and barking, and it found them in the last 100 yards and it turned and barked them home. And over the dog's barking, lifting his face up off the rope for the first time, Elias saw it. The window. The big strange watchtower window we'd all laughed at, throwing its square of gold light out into the storm, and now, finally, close enough that it cut through the white. The light that had told the whole valley nothing all night because the whole valley was asleep. The light that had told Maria everything hours ago from the bottom of a buried van. He crawled toward his own light with his face in the snow, and Maria crawled behind him singing, and the dog barked them the last of the way, and they fell through the door of the fortress on the hill, the tomb, the witch house, the fool's folly, into a room that was warm, full of children wrapped in every blanket and coat and curtain the man owned. And Elias Crane got his last 2 through the door, and then he lay down on his own floor and did not get up. I knew none of this, of course, lying in my house in the bottoms while the storm spent itself. The wind broke just before dawn. It didn't stop. It never just stops, but it broke, dropped from a scream to a long, exhausted moan, and I must have slept an hour or 2 in my chair because I came awake stiff and cold with the lamp guttered out and a thin gray light at the windows. I went out to the animals first. A man's first thought out here is always the animals, and I won't pretend otherwise. They'd made it, crowded and complaining and alive, breathing out great clouds in the dark of the barn. My roof had held, though it scared me to look at the load on it. The world outside was changed past recognizing, fences gone, the road gone, the creek a smooth white seam, drifts curled up against the south side of everything like something sleeping. And the silence. After a night of that wind, the silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I went back to the house and I made coffee on the wood stove because the power was still days from coming back, and I stood at my kitchen window with the cup warming my hands, and out of pure habit I looked north, up the slope, toward the ridge. The window was still lit. It had been lit all night. I knew that without knowing why I knew it, the way you sometimes do. That little gold square had not gone dark once in all those killing hours, and standing there in the dawn, I felt the first cold finger of understanding go down my back, because a man asleep lets his fire die, and a man warm and easy doesn't keep a lamp burning in his window through a whole blizzard for no reason. A lit window in a storm is a signal. I'd known that my whole life. I just hadn't let myself think about who might be reading it. It was Dale Mercer's boy on a snow machine who found the van. The county dug out enough to move by mid-morning, men on machines and a borrowed tractor, all of us out checking on each other the way you do after, going house to house counting heads. And it was the Mercer boy who came on the church van 2 miles down the county road, buried to its roof, dug out at one window where a hole had been clawed down through the drift, and inside nothing. Empty. Doors open. 9 child-sized spaces and no children. I will not soon forget the sound the parents made when that word came down the line. 9 families, half the valley, who'd been told the program ran late, and the roads were bad and surely they'd hold up somewhere safe. 9 families standing in the wreck of the worst night of their lives looking at an empty buried van. And the math of an empty van in a blizzard is a math that gives you only one answer, and it is the worst one. It was Maria's husband who saw the tracks. Not tracks, by then the wind had taken the footprints, but a line. A faint disturbed seam in the snow leading up off the road and up the slope, the ghost of a path where 11 people had crawled and been carried, and at the top of it, far up on the bare shoulder of the mountain. The lit window. I have seen men run before. I have never seen men run like those fathers ran up that mountain through hip-deep snow, falling, clawing, screaming children's names into a silence that gave nothing back. I went up behind them, slower, an old man's pace, with my heart going in a way the doctor would have frowned at. And I was maybe halfway up, lungs burning, when I heard the first of them reach the top and start to howl, and I couldn't tell. I swear to you I could not tell from that sound whether it was grief or joy, because the 2 of them make the very same sound at the start. It was joy. The door of the cabin stood open, and out of it into the blazing white morning came children, wrapped in curtains and a stranger's coats, blinking, alive, alive, Maria's daughter and Toby with his cowlick, and 7 more, every single one of them, carried and crawled and sung up a mountain in the dark and kept warm all night in a fortress built by a man we'd laughed at. 11 went into the storm, 11 came out. I stood at the edge of his clearing with my hat in my hands, the same clearing where he'd met me with sawdust in his beard a year and a half before, and I watched parents fall to their knees in the snow with their children in their arms, and I cried in front of grown men and didn't care who saw, and through the open door of that warm cabin I could see, on the floor, the dog lying pressed against a man who was very still. He lived. I'll tell you that now because I've made you carry the dread this far and that's enough. Elias Crane lived, but I won't tell you he came through it whole because he didn't, and the part where he didn't is the part I most need you to hold on to. His hands were gone. Not gone, but the cold had been in them too long, and the doctors in town and then in the city did what they could, which wasn't everything. He lost most of the fingers on his right hand and 2 on his left. The hands that had stacked 2 winters of wood, that had dug a well through solid rock, that had built every thick wall of that ark with a hand plane and a stubbornness we'd all mistaken for foolishness. Those hands had dug 9 children out of a buried van and carried them up a mountain 3 times by his face on his knees, and the price for that was the hands themselves. He never once in all the years after let anyone say it was too high a price. He'd just look at you, and Elias Crane had a way of looking at you that ended a conversation, and you'd let it go. The valley, of course, lost its mind with gratitude. You'd expect that. For about a month there was a current of it so strong it embarrassed everybody, casseroles and committees and a man from the city paper who wanted to write Elias up as a hero and got about 4 words out of him for his trouble. There was talk of a plaque. There was talk, God help us, of renaming the road. He hated all of it. Not from false modesty, he simply had no use for it, the way he'd had no use for the power line. One afternoon when the fuss was at its worst he told Maria, who told me, the truest thing anybody said in the whole aftermath. She'd come up to thank him again, the way they all kept doing, and she'd started to cry and call him a hero, and he'd cut her off, not unkind, just done with it, and he'd said, "I'm not a hero, I just didn't build for myself." And that was the whole of it, wasn't it? That was the thing we'd none of us understood. We built our houses for fair days, in the easy bottoms, for the lives we hoped to have. He'd built his for the worst day, on the hard hill, for a night he prayed would never come. And when it came, the house was big enough and strong enough and warm enough for 11, because somewhere in whatever life he'd lived before ours, he'd learned the one thing the rest of us never had: that the storm always comes eventually, and the only question that matters is whether you spent the fair days getting ready for it or laughing at the man who did. I went up to see him in the spring. The snow was off by then, the slope gone green and the creek loud with melt, and I rode up the way I had that first summer, and this time I didn't bring a jar of preserves. I brought my logbook. I don't fully know why. I think I wanted him to see that somebody else in the valley wrote the sky down. I think I wanted to say something and didn't have the words for it, and the book was a way to put a thing in his ruined hands instead. He was on his porch. The dog came down to sniff my boots, and this time it stayed, leaned its whole weight against my leg, and Elias watched it do that with something that was almost a smile. We didn't talk much. He wasn't a man you talked much with, and I'd made my peace with that. We sat on his porch and looked out the way the porch looked out over the bare north slope, toward the weather, the wrong way, the right way, and after a long while I made myself say the thing I'd come to say. I told him I'd laughed. I told him what I'd said, that October evening, about a man making life hard so he'd have something to push against, and I told him I'd been carrying it ever since and I was sorry. He was quiet a long time, long enough that I figured that was that. Then he held up what was left of his right hand, turned it over and looked at it like it belonged to somebody he used to know, and he said, "You weren't wrong." I waited. "Man does need something to push against," he said. "Most spend their whole lives pushing against nothing and call it peace." He nodded out at the slope, at the weather that wasn't there yet but always would be, eventually, again. I just picked something worth pushing on. And then, and this is the part I'll keep for myself longest, he looked over at my logbook, where I'd set it on the rail between us, and he asked me what the geese had done that fall, before the storm. I told him. Went over early, in numbers I hadn't seen since I was a boy, all of them in a hurry. He nodded slow, like a man filing it away, like a man already reading the next storm in the one that just passed. And I understood, sitting on that porch in the green spring with the dog warm against my leg, that Elias Crane was never going to stop watching the weather come. That some men carry a thing inside them that won't let them rest in the fair days, and that I'd spent a year and a half calling that thing foolishness when its right name, all along, was love. The hard, unglamorous, 2 winters' worth of firewood kind. The kind that builds an ark for strangers and pays for it in fingers and never once asks to be thanked. The children renamed his cabin, by the way. The same children who'd called it the witch house and dared each other up the road to look at it. They don't call it that anymore. I won't tell you the new name, it's theirs, not mine, and you'd only roll your eyes at how plain it is. I'll tell you this instead, and then I'll let you go. That fall, when the geese went over early again, I caught myself standing in my yard with my cold coffee, watching them, counting them, the way I'd watched them my whole life and never once acted on what they told me. And before I went back inside, I looked up the hill. The window was lit. It's always lit now. Through every storm, fair night or foul, that one gold square burns up there on the dark shoulder of the mountain where the weather comes from, and I have come to need it the way you need a thing you didn't know was holding you up. I check for it the way I check on my animals, first thing. I don't know what I'd do if I looked up one night and it was dark. I haven't had to find out yet.